Hey there, Ryan Reynolds here. It's a new year, and you know what that means. No, not the diet. Resolutions. A way for us all to try and do a little bit better than we did last year. And my resolution, unlike big wireless, is to not be a raging and raise the price of wireless on you every chance I get. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited. See mintmobile.com for details.
This episode is brought to you by Atlassian. Atlassian makes the team collaboration software that powers enterprise businesses around the world, including over 80% of the Fortune 500. With Atlassian's AI-powered software like Jira, Confluence, and Loom, you'll have more time to do the work that matters. In fact, Atlassian customers experience a 25% reduction in project duration per year. Unleash the potential of your team at Atlassian.com. Atlassian.
At the Musial with Alan and Daniel, we'll talk about the Cardinals all night long. Everyone come gather round, listen to your favorite sound. We'll talk about the Cardinals all night long. We'll talk the games and all the rest, about the team that we love best. We'll talk about the Cardinals all night long. We're gonna talk about the Cardinals all night long.
Good evening. Welcome into another edition of Meet Me at Musial. We're starting season 11 here on the show. With me, as always, Alan Medlock, a Medlock One, and it's not a real season kickoff if we don't have Jeff Jones, Belleville Democrat, with us. Jeff, thanks for joining us yet again.
Yeah, guys, I've been working on my tight 20 minutes on Jose Barrero, so I think we should have some good stuff for tonight. So we should be all right.
Yeah, we're going to have to do deep dives because it's not like the Cardinals have given us a whole lot of things on the surface to deal with. But before we get into the lack of winter stuff, Jeff, let's look back. I know your most recent article, or I think it's your most recent one, kind of took a look back at some of the highlights of last season, and there were some. It's a little bit strange. We kind of have that same, it feels to me when I look at Twitter, and that's a bad thing to do, that a lot of people still have that same mindset that they did after 2023, like everything was terrible last year, and it really wasn't.
Yeah, it really wasn't. And when I'm trying to figure out why that is, what that feeling was like, I do think a big part of it was that the hangover from 23 was so significant that it really dragged down into the next year. And I think too that the ways in which this team were successful, they won a lot of close games and they got blown out a lot of nights, right? And so even when they were doing well and putting streaks together, it didn't feel like they were accomplishing all that much. Again, you start the season with things going bad after the previous year having gone bad, and that's a lot of negative momentum that I just think they were inevitably just not able to overcome.
Yeah, and then of course, the good part of that season, or at least when you're looking on the field, was from what, mid-May to mid-August, maybe not even that far. So the beginning was bad and the end was kind of up, and
Right.
so your first impression, your last impression are this was not a great year.
Yeah, I think that's an entirely fair way to look at it. And I also think that the success that they did have, it didn't happen in an exciting way, right? Like your two arguable headline players had really kind of below par seasons. The most exciting prospect in your organization that your fans were so excited about gave you, really nothing at all at the big leagues last year. And instead it was, hey, Andrew Kittredge is pretty good, and Ryan Helsley is striking a bunch of guys out. Like the Helsley part of that was exciting, but otherwise it was not the most engaging brand of baseball.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's probably telling that the number one moment on your list, and I think it's very accurate number one moment, was Tommy Pham's grand slam. And Tommy Pham was here for like 10 minutes.
Yeah,
That
no
was it. That
doubt.
was it. So it was a very transient year, I guess.
Yeah, and I mean, honestly, when I sat down to work through that list, I looked over the box scores again and again. I'm like, am I missing something? Like Goldschmidt had a walk off
Mhm.
in there. That did have, but I mean, it really wasn't a lot of stuff that jumped off the page for me. And the Rick the Rickwood stuff is one that I guess you would definitely
Mhm.
include sort of from a broader perspective, right? That trip, I was
Right.
really grateful to be able to make that trip, and that was a really special week. But just limiting it to stuff that happened like in a game on field action, unless you're going to go with maybe the Brendan Donovan home run from that game, or Adam Kloffenstein Palooza. It's
Yeah.
hard to kind of point out a particular moment from
Nobody had a higher moment in that game than Adam Kloffenstein since it was his only one. So,
I'll tell you,
um,
I so that evening, because of the way things were hectic, we ended up on the field post game, which almost never happens. But we're on the field, and the Kloffenstein family is on the field, and I know John Denton was talking to Adam Kloffenstein's dad, and and JD said something like, congratulations, we'll have a bunch more, blah blah blah. And I guess Adam's dad said to him, he got one. As long as he got this one, that's good enough. And now when you kind of look at where Adam Kloffenstein's at right now, that's a pretty wildly prophetic thing to have said that night.
yeah, yeah, and maybe his dad should have said, well, maybe 2 or 3.
Yeah, you're right.
Yeah,
A little more specific with the wishes. Yeah.
that's right. That's right. Um, and you also pointed out, because I think for me or, and for a lot of people, maybe if you do think about this season 5 years from now, it's going to be the Mason Wynn rookie year, and that was such a year that it didn't have a specific moment necessarily, but it was a kind of sustained excellence that is hard to just, boil down to one thing.
Yeah, I think that I guess I should say I hope that people have a really good appreciation for just kind of how special the year was that we saw out of Mason Wynn last season. That that kind of defensive skill, like the kind of things he can do in the field, that really does not come that often. Like
Mhm,
I have been fortunate to get to see some preternaturally like gifted defensive players over the last half decade or so, right? Like Nolan Arenado at his peak, when
mhm,
he first got to St. Louis, was that guy. Harrison Bader had stretches of being that guy. Mason does stuff that I don't see any of those other guys do, right? Like just comparative to the
mhm.
position. And so that's really exciting. And then to also be a significantly positive offensive player on top of it, I don't know that you really could have drawn up a better rookie season from any kind of realistic perspective than the one that we got.
It's a little bit surprising to me in regard to that, and we haven't seen everything. We haven't seen the how the Cardinals are going to promote this coming year, except for, you know, it's not gonna be good. It seems to be their motto right now. But it is a little bit more surprising to me that they haven't elevated Mason Wynn to kind of that face of the franchise thing. We saw a little bit of that with Harrison Bader, after his first year, he's modeling the new powder blues and doing things of that nature and kind of seems to be everywhere. And it just doesn't feel like, and maybe I've just missed it, but it doesn't feel like the Cardinals have necessarily capitalized on what Mason Wynn is yet.
Well, I will say to that point though, when they released the schedule of the promotional items, I think there are 4 separate Mason Wynn item nights. I
Ooh,
don't think anybody
that's
else has
fair.
any more than one.
Yeah.
So I mean, so they have steered a little bit into that, right? The
Mm,
other part of that though is there are clubhouse dynamics that kind of go along with that sort of passing of a torch when you have the setup the Cardinals have currently, right? Like when you have a
mhm,
clubhouse where it was 2 guys, but now with just Nolan left there for now, who kind of looms over that as a figure at that point in his career, and kind of with that respect in there, it's sort of tough to grab a rookie and hold him up and say, no, this is our guy. That's kind of a precarious thing to do. So I think that if the big offseason question kind of resolves itself in the way we all expect it to here in the coming weeks, I think then we would probably see a pretty quick shift to a little more of that Mason Wynn front and center.
Do you think that's the natural fit if the trade's made to go to? Because that you touched on 2 things that I wanted to talk about tonight. and one of which was win season. And your admiration means that tells me a whole lot about what he meant to the ball club and what he actually means to St. Louis, because it fits into so many things that, lifelong fans that's important to him. The ultra defensive shortstop, where I'm going with that.
Yeah.
But also the leadership angle that they could potentially be lacking. But my question turns into, does the spotlight go to win quickly? And is that going to be a move that I feel like they have to make pretty quickly if they're going to promote the youth so much that you're going to have to double down and, make him a priority?
So I do think that it probably does turn to Mason pretty fast and put him pretty front and center. I will say the Cardinals' ideal version of that is probably that it puts like Wynn and Gorman and Walker front and center, right? Like ideally for the Cardinals, they get themselves to a point, even if it doesn't happen right away, if Nolan gets traded before they get to spring and February and this takes until May or June, the Cardinals would like it that was a 3-person, that was Gorman and Wynn and Walker together in that spotlight. Is that super likely? We'll see. Of that group of guys, I think I probably have more questions about Gorman than I do Walker. But I do think that ideally is what they want to see happen.
Well, with that being said, is there any world where Wynn has kind of taken a lot of the pressure off those two?
That's something that I've actually kind of wondered about. And that was, to be honest, one thing that I wanted to talk to Mason and Jordan both in spring about is like that relationship that we've written so much about between the two of them has sort of always been classified around Jordan sprinting and Mason trailing up behind him into the majors, right? And so to me, it's a really interesting question. Okay, when that reverses and Mason is the guy having sustained success in the big leagues and Jordan is the guy who kind of can't find it, what does that look like? And I think that's an interesting question, just sort of based around, the way that I think that we have come to understand their relationship and sort of how that has colored the coverage of them over the last handful of years.
Yeah, I'm very interested in seeing, and we've got a lot of guys. There's a lot of different young guys that will get a focus anyway, but definitely if Nolan Arenado is traded. Now, before we get more into maybe where he goes or if he goes or all that kind of stuff, last year at this time we were using the L word quite a bit, leadership, and there was the reporting that that Nolan and Goldie had pretty much asked for help in that regard. Do you think that over the season Nolan grew in that regard, or is it still a situation where that's just not what he does?
I just think that kind of the way that his personality is and the way that he kind of wraps himself around the game, I don't know that it necessarily lends itself to ever being that kind of guy. I thought it was telling that at the winter meetings, Joel Wolf, who is Nolan's agent, was intending to have a big press gaggle for Roki Sasaki, who he also reps. But there were enough of us there who had Nolan questions that he kind of splintered off to the side and we talked. And one of the things that Joel said, it said, frankly, to us on the record, right, was that Nolan is a guy who can sometimes rub his teammates the wrong way. And if the agent is saying that to reporters, that it's a pretty good indication of how that can be to deal with in the clubhouse, right? Like Nolan has a pathological need to win that I think people admire in athletes writ large, but that I think if it starts to trend the wrong direction, you can really kind of string it against the straps a little bit. And it is maybe not the best environment for everyone involved.
Did you see that?
Yeah, I think I got a sense of that. I'm not going to I will absolutely not pretend to be like the person that Nolan is closest to in the clubhouse and confides a bunch of deep, dark secrets in me, right? But yeah, in the same way that if you go to work with somebody and you see them every day, you can get a pretty good sense of this is a good day to talk and this is maybe not a good day to talk. And when the not good ones start to pile up, you kind of get a sense of where things are leaning in that direction.
It's interesting.
Yeah, I was just kind of curious because, we did see, and again, pictures and things like that are staged or whatever the case may be. But we did see some interactions with Nolan and some of the younger guys later in the year that made me think that maybe he had taken a little bit of that on his shoulders. But if not, and if he is, or if he is, even if he has, and if he's gone at the beginning of the year, where does that leadership come from? I mean, I think there's a lot of guys on this team that can provide it, but where would you say it most likely comes from?
Yeah, I think if we're going to start listing names, Brendan Donovan is the first one. I think that's the guy who I know has a lot of respect from a lot of guys in there, and certainly from the coaching staff as well. That's also a guy who now at this point is going to be one of the more experienced position players on the team. Wilson Contreras and pretty well him is kind of where it's pointed, right?
Right.
So it's a guy who has at least that much perspective, and a guy who is super well regarded around the league, right? When your friends on other teams are talking and asking you about him and how he is a guy, that stuff kind of gets around, right? So I think that is where it would start. It's different for pitchers. Obviously, that's going to be a staff where Sonny takes on some of that for sure. The other thing I guess that I'll say here, because if it's in this conversation, is that I'll believe that they're not re-signing Kyle Gibson when he puts pen to paper somewhere else. I think that's going to happen. I think they're going to work that out. So, if I'm right about that, then Gibson is for sure a guy who plays a big part in that, played a huge role in that last year. So that would be some places where I would kind of look at it.
What's Contreras' presence in the clubhouse?
I think it's I don't hesitate because I'm trying to think of the right way to describe it. I think that everybody understands. Everybody understands kind of who Wilson is on his own terms, right? And so if you're somebody who needs to be fired up, who needs to hear a vamo and go, then Wilson is a guy who can maybe do a lot for you and really picks you up on a day-to-day basis. If you're a guy who maybe turn in a little bit and doesn't need that, needs to work through it or whatever, then maybe it's not like your favorite model of leadership. But definitely a guy who is well respected and brings a lot of energy. And, I think his teammates have a really good appreciation for kind of what he's done and the respect that comes from that.
Yeah, and with 26 people in that clubhouse, and then some as they come and go, not everybody's going to respond the same way to the same people. I mean, that's just obviously the case, and hopefully more people than not do. When you've got a guy like Contreras, who obviously is very passionate about the team and has done, when you're willing to change positions this early in a contract, especially. I think that told everybody what they need to know about what he thought, at least about St. Louis.
Yeah, and I guess what I would say is I will not profess to be Mr. Clubhouse energy expert, right? But just sort of the sampling of teams that I've covered up close, I would say that this year's clubhouse was maybe a little more cohesive than average, right? It was pretty good. There were good groups of guys that spent a lot of time together. There was some crossover between that. There was not that much very little, I guess, in the way of obvious hostility, right? Really not very much of that. There are all these questions about leadership and who has to be a leader and who takes that on. That kind of shows itself in various ways. And I do think one sign that you have a good, healthy clubhouse culture is just that you can see it, right? Even if, there aren't maybe individuals who are really hammering the leader button. If the clubhouse culture is good and the group fits together and can pull all in the same direction, that's okay too.
Yeah, I think that as fans, a lot of times we think that leadership equals wins, and that's
Sure.
always the case, right? I mean, if you could have a really good team that's really cohesive, but they're not that good, and then just not win some ball games. So I think that especially now, and especially since the front office made such a point of it after 2023, that it becomes a little bit of a fallback to say that's what they need. But I think that there's, like you said, Brendan Donovan already last year, even when they were talking about that, seemed to be a guy that had taken on that mantle. And it's very interesting to see him continue to do that.
I will tell this because I think this is a good story kind of about Brendan Donovan and the kind of guy that he is. At one point, he had he had won some award, and I should know what it is, but he won an award from MLB for his charitable work. He does a lot of work with veterans groups and that. And at one point, just making conversation, I asked him if he had done anything with the Veterans Hospital here in St. Louis, and he said no. And okay, whatever. And about 5 minutes later, I feel a tap on my arm, and it's Brendan, and he has his phone, and he's asking me the name of the hospital, the name of the JB rehab down here, where it's at in town, and all this, right? So, like, this was, it was a little bit of a nothing conversation. He made a point to circle back, like, no, like, where's the Veterans Hospital at? Where's the rehab home at? What are they called? How do I get there? So, who knows what came of that, right? But it just, to me, that was an indication of a guy who is sincerely committed to the stuff he's committed to.
So you said you expect Kyle Gibson to sign with the Cardinals at any moment, pretty much. I don't want to say it that way.
Well, no. So and here, what this is. I expect them to trade at least one of Matt Serfetti, and when they do, that Gibson would follow that. That is what I expect to happen.
Okay, that's what I was going to get at. It was like, where does that leave the rotation if they're doing that? But okay, if you're saying they're going to clear up one of those spots, then I understand. Okay.
Yeah, my expectation would be, well, and I think it's fairly easy to suss out. They would rather trade Matz. It will be easier to trade Fetty. That is bottom line, kind of where it's at, right? So if there is a partner for Matz, I think that they would be eager to get that done. The problem, of course, is like the reason to do that deal is to clear the money. And so you would need someone who wants to take on all of Matt's, which is not like it's 12 points, 12 and a half. So it's not insane, but it's not nothing. Right. So, it might be hard to find a fit there. The one thing that works in the Cardinals' benefit to that is that Steven Matz does not have trade protection, so they can do what they want to do.
Yeah. Do you see that move happening regardless of Arenado trade or not?
I do. Just in terms of like when they talk about the desire, clearly is to trade Arenado to clear money. If they're able to clear, even 60% of it, that's still a little bit that's hanging around, obviously, for the next couple of years. And then you're also talking about if you flip that money back into another signing, then you're not really saving much at all. Yeah. Whereas if you do that and then couple it with trading one of the pitchers, again, I think they would prefer the more expensive, of the two. Then that frees you up. I think Gibson's option was for 10-5 and the buyout was 1, something like that. So you could sign him for 1 year and $10 million. He makes $500K for the trouble of getting his option declined and then re-signed again, and everybody comes out pretty much where they were.
Lance Lynn was on Foul Territory, and he made a comment about how the Cardinals had reached out to him, but they were going to wait until later in the offseason to make a move. Do you think that aligns with what you think? Not necessarily that it's going to be Lynn, but do you think that's what they probably told some of the veteran starters, that, hey, we're not going to be in play, this is what our plan is, and that it probably aligns more with a Gibson signing?
Yeah, so I hadn't heard that from Lance. That's pretty interesting, but that does pretty much line up with with kind of what I thought. To hear him say the Cardinals reached out, I think is interesting too, because I think all parties were definitely treating that last start at the end of the season like that was it. That was going to be his last game as a Cardinal. He was at peace with that. He was closing the door. But if the offers aren't elsewhere and there is one here, then maybe I never say never. I don't think ever expected that he would come back for a year even. So if it works out, then it works out. But I do think that Gibson is probably the guy they would prefer, and if for no other reason than just the innings have been more reliable. Sure. Right? They got 60 more innings out of Gibson than Lynn last year, something like that. I just think that from the pure innings total, because the reason that you would, if the Cardinals want to swap Matz for Gibson, is that you need that day to be taken up. You got to play. You got to play games, and you need somebody who can take the ball, so you're not scrambling to kind of grab guys off the scrap heap, or you're pushing guys. You're making Graceffo start when he's maybe a reliever. Yada yada yada. You want to put yourself in a spot where you can reliably fill those innings, and that to me is the reason to prefer Gibson to either Matz or Lynn.
You talked about them trying to trade Arenado to get clear of the money, which we all understand. But it seems to me that the the messaging has changed on that over the course of the winter, because it really didn't seem like it started out as a salary dump, and now it has become, at least maybe not, much more of a salary dump than it was originally
Yeah,
intended to be.
I think that you are right that the messaging has changed. I think that the messaging kind of at the start of the winter was, it's best for all parties. No one
Mhm.
wants to go in. And like best for all parties, I guess, is euphemistically about money, right? Because why is it best for the Cardinals? Because it's cheaper.
Right.
Right. So like maybe you're kind of sniffing around in the same area. But I do agree that that's a total shift to, being asked why, because we would like to clear salary. Okay, that's pretty explicit, but you've already cleared a really big chunk. And if the goal
Mhm.
is to still cut another 25, then oh boy, then you're talking about trimming off like 85 million in the winter, and that feels like a concern. Like that's not we're investing in player development. That's hey, where those couple dozen $1,000,000 go?
Yeah, and I mean, at the beginning of the winter, they didn't necessarily have the security of the TV contract. Now they know what it is. It's less, but it's still not, you know, it's not like it didn't exist at all. So I don't know. It all of this, I think the club had a lot of goodwill when they came out, although maybe not the DeWitts themselves, came out talking about this change in philosophy, and we're going to do this over the winter. But as the winter has gone on, and we've seen, except for the front office hires, less of, less tangible benefits of that. People have soured a bit on that.
I you know I will say here, and I will admit to this as potentially a bias in my own coverage. So if you want to factor that into things are right in the future, then hey, I get it. I kind of don't believe them when they talk about the TV thing being that big an issue. Because even in the
Mhm.
most grim potentialities here, I think they were very assured that they were going to get something on the order of like 60 cents on the dollar from MLB. That's not ideal. They ended up getting 73 cents on the dollar, pretty close to that, right? So obviously, you're
Mhm.
talking about a 20% jump over what it could have been. But in terms of real dollars, in terms of the revenues, it's not that big a deal. Like I do believe that it probably upset maybe some of the precision of their projections, but I have a really hard time wrapping my brain around that as a sincere excuse. I think that this is something that, especially given the shape of the landscape, like I don't know. I don't think this cropped up in the last 6 months and they're scrambling. I think they've had a
Mhm.
good long runway to kind of ease themselves into what this position would look like.
Yeah, and I mean, the Cardinals are well positioned to sell streaming services. I mean, they've got one of the biggest national markets if they wanted to go that way. So, I've never I've never had the concern of their TV revenue as well because of things like that. But I mean, I do love a good spreadsheet, so I understand when it gets messed up a little bit. But it's a little bit, it's a little bit disconcerting to hear, okay, well, we're gonna have to make these drastic cuts when revenue drops a little bit, but when revenue goes up, I mean, there's not the corresponding, well, let's go out and splurge. Oh, well, we'll keep our powder dry.
Yeah, there was a fun little viral infographic that was going around a couple of weeks ago that listed like every team's biggest contract they ever signed,
Mhm, mhm.
and I want to say the Cardinals were like 26th ish, and that was the
Yeah.
Goldschmidt deal. So yeah, I mean, and it was like I'm pretty sure it was like Rays, Pirates, Guards, Cardinals, maybe the White Sox in there. It was like it was the
Mhm.
club that you don't want to be in. And they're that's a cold reality of all this. Like for all of the money they say that they have spent, they have not really kind of gone above and beyond for any one individual player. They didn't do Harper and Goldschmidt in the same winter, for
Right,
instance.
right.
And the kind of middle bets, have been Steven Matz, and that puts you in a really tough spot.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair for them to point out that they spend maybe a little bit above market size, but that's also, how do they spend it? You're spending a lot of extra money that you don't need to on Miles Michaelis and others like Brett Cecil and going back, and a lot of dead money where it hasn't translated as well. So, again, I think all of us are hopeful that the change in regime, as it will, may bring a little bit of different look at the free agent market. But again, end of the day, it's the DeWitts that make that call, and I don't know if that has changed.
And look, I'm not going to sit and claim that I have like perfect foresight here. Like I will own the fact that I thought that the Michaelis deal was a good deal. I thought that that was a reasonable rate that extended a guy who was reliable. And in my reasoning for that, I said, well, look, that's not a guy who really is reliant on stuff. He's reliant on mix and he's reliant on location. And I thought that was going to be durable. And then he signed the deal and immediately lost his location, and now he gets clocked because he's in the heart of the plane, right? I whiffed on that one. What are you going to, I thought location was a thing that guys aged with. I grew up when Greg Maddux was like, what am I going to say?
Yeah.
But yeah, and it's not always ones that you can see super far in advance is my point. But the ones that it feels like you can see in advance, the one where it's 3 years and 27 or whatever it was for Brett Cecil, and everyone goes, "Oh, the whole league does one of those." It's. I talked about this before with a lot of folks in terms of kind of like self-awareness. If you're a baseball organization, if you're the Colorado Rockies, and Chris Bryant says he'll take the deal, don't you immediately go, "Oh, we messed up"? You have to have the awareness to go, we were the only ones even close. You got to, and that's tough. There's really no way out of that other than, I guess, to draft out of it or trade out of it or whatever. But that's the kind of organizational self-awareness that I think the Cardinals have probably lost for a while. And I think a lot of what this current project is about is trying to find that again.
Yeah. So I have a couple of questions about the roster. There's a couple of roster battles as we go into spring that it feels to me, at least from what I've heard from what the front office has said, that they're going to be a different decision than I would make. Let's start at catcher though. Ivan Herrera, Pedro Pages. The front office feels, to me, at least from what I've heard, feels a little bit more enamored with Pages than I would have expected. Is that accurate, or is it just me misreading things?
So I think that's accurate, but I would also say that I don't necessarily think that it affects kind of the roster at the start of the season in any way, right? Like I do think the front office, I think they like Pages a lot more now than they expected to. I think that when they added him to the 40-man, before this past season, that to me was a clue that, like, oh, interesting. Like they found something here that they like, because they floated him once before, and he's a glove first catcher, and like every organization has a guy like that, right? Like everybody's got their own guy. You usually don't need to pluck one. So when that happened, it was kind of interesting. And then he came up, and then he didn't hit. He didn't hit for 12 games or whatever. And it was like, well, yeah, this kind of was what you were going to see. But then he started to hit, and he put up like a perfect backup catcher season, right? He hit 210. Right. He ran into a handful of homers, and he handled the staff well when he played. So great. Now, does that make him an 80-game catcher? That's harder for me. Whereas with Herrera, the bat just plays at such a level to where if you can get him to be a passable catcher, like average to slightly below average, if he's going to do that and also be, a 120 OPS plus, he's a hugely positive player for you. And so I think that they want Herrera to work out. And they want him to be able to kind of control games defensively. And if that can happen, they're going to give him lots of space to be the guy.
And then let's move like directly straight up, I guess, if you will. Center field. A lot of talk about Michael Ciani, especially early in the winter. But Victor Scott too is right there as well. Where are they leaning on that?
I think you would have to say that Ciani probably has incumbency. How much that matters, is maybe kind of hard to say, but I do think if they were completely honest, they would say that on day one of spring, Michael Ciani is the starter. I would expect that he would probably be in that first lineup of spring if he wants to be. Now, I don't know that that means that they think that he is a guy who has a higher ceiling than Victor Scott. In fact, I'm fairly confident they don't think that's the case. But I do think that they're going to give Ciani a little bit of run, if for no other reason than if he turns in like a second season or a second whatever half season, 60% of the season as an elite defensive center fielder, that's probably a guy who has a lot of trade value because that's a guy who has control, and that's a guy who every playoff team wants on their bench, right? Everybody wants Terrence
Right.
Moore. And Michael Ciani is like an elite version of that. And so, that makes him an asset and gives you a little bit more time with Scott, who I think in retrospect, it's fair to say was just wasn't ready, wasn't ready to hit at the big league level the way he's going to need to survive.
Well, that kind of, I'm glad you said that because when they had both of them on the roster last year, it felt about as out of place as you can get. So if it is Ciani, which I would anticipate it is, that would be Scott in Memphis for a run, I hope.
Yeah, I think so. And I to that point about them both being on the roster, I will tell you. So that Saturday, I guess it was still Sunday morning. It was Sunday, September 1st at Yankee Stadium. We're in the office. Ollie says that Ciani's coming off. He's going to be the extra guy, but he's not there that day. He's going to meet him, and they went to where did they go to Cleveland, wherever they went. He was going to meet him, Cincinnati maybe. He was going to meet him where they were. We kept asking about how they both fit, and he just kept coming. He just kept coming back to that's the way it is today. That's the way it is today. And eventually, the only thing I could figure out was that Victor has to play today because he was in the lineup that day. Victor has to play today. The manager's not going to say pregame that he's going down postgame. So he's just treading water until they make the announcement. That was how I rationalized it. And then they got to Cincy or whatever the next day, and they were both on the roster. And I was like, you got to be kidding me. And that didn't make it So whatever their explanation was for that, I did not make sense. It really didn't.
Yeah. I agree. You obviously can't have them both on the roster at the same time. I thought Scott had hit better at the end of that when he actually got a run there in August. But I can understand a little bit of why you don't necessarily. I mean, again, now, do you think and we've seen too much of this, so I hope the answer is no. Do you think that spring training makes any kind of impact on those kind of decisions? Because I feel like the last couple of years we've seen strong spring trainings make an impact when they shouldn't have.
Yeah, I think, if we were to take them at their word about kind of what they're doing with the roster this season, that should mean that there are basically no competitions in spring.
Mm-hmm.
Center would be the one, if you think that there's a chance that Victor Scott so outplays Ciani in spring that he forces the issue. I guess that would be the one, but that doesn't really I don't see that necessarily happening. The other thing too would be, I guess, if they weren't able to get an Arenado deal done, what does that mean for Nootbaar in center and Donovan in left? Is that what that looks like? Yeah, who can say? That's a spot that they really don't want to go down. So I think it'll, cross that bridge when they get there. I really don't think that they're going to get to that bridge, but maybe they might. But other than that, yeah, I mean, you're talking about there's probably a competition for the utility man beyond that and the bullpen. But otherwise, you'd be looking at a pretty set lineup.
Back to the Arenado deal just a second. I know that with the no trade and the fact that he's turned one down already and, there's limited suitors, can the Cardinals even get into a desperation mode with Arenado, really? You know what I mean? To where it's like, hey, we have a lineup written up right now that doesn't have you in it. I know they're not going to approach him like that, and both sides are going to act like, hey, we're happy we're still together, but is there a point where they're like, hey, this kind of screws up our plans?
There might be. I don't really know, though, what that would really look like because the amount of suitors, the amount of suitors is really not that big. And Nolan knows who the teams are. The agent is involved. Everybody knows who the players are here, and they're just sort of waiting for it to shake itself out. I think that there is a little bit of a standoff happening with him and Bregman in that. I think that they're probably, I think that Boston, for instance, is confident that they're going to get one of them, thinks that they're going to get one of them, and is waiting for one or the other to blink. To me, I was joking with somebody earlier. To me, if I'm Mo, I'm on the phone every day with Scott Boras pushing Bregman to Detroit. I think Scott to get him to take Detroit's money, right? Every day I'm trying to make that happen. But no, I I just think they're going to get a deal done. I just think that it's so far down this road now, and then everybody kind of knows the score here. I just think they're going to figure it out. However complex it might be, whatever the posturing looks like, it's January 3rd, right? When Arenado was traded from Colorado to the Cardinals, that deal happened on February 1st. And what happened was the thing that I think might happen this time. Nolan went home for the holidays and spent time around his folks and the people around him, and they talked incessantly for weeks about what next year was going to look like. And finally, he had enough and made a deal happen. And it would not surprise me at all if that's sort of what we see over the next week to 10 days
here. Yeah, I'm not sure who posted this initially, so I don't want there to be like we don't believe the writer. Do you give any credibility to that Stroman for Arenado deal?
Sort of, kind of, because that version of the story can be read differently by different people. I think that it's fair to imply that from that probably came from a Yankees side person, and let's say Mo calls and says, "Hey, we don't want to talk about Arenado," and Cashman on the phone says, "Yeah, I don't know if there's anything there. Sorry, Mo." And they hang up, and then Cashman turns to the guy next to him and says, "I mean, we would have done Stroman for Arenado, but they're not doing that. Ha, ha, ha." Right? Like, there's a version of that conversation that, where there's a lot of truth all around it. I think it is logical to look at those two pieces and think that the Yankees might want to try to move one for the other, but I don't know how far down the road maybe it got.
Yeah.
Nolan Gorman. Where I guess just what are your thoughts on him and what we've seen over the last couple of years? What do you expect out of him maybe going forward?
I really don't know. Like the contact rate is so hard to suss out because it's just so like it was so unsustainably low last year, and did not come with the kind of peaks that go with those valleys that he's sort of shown in the past. Like it just wasn't. You weren't getting nearly enough production at the top end, and the low end got really, really low. I understand certainly why he finished the year where he did. I get why that happens. I understand too not wanting to bring him up in September, let him end the year on kind of a positive feel from AAA and work from there. But I don't know how you fix the contact rate. If I did, I guess I would be coaching hitters in AA somewhere, right? Like I don't know how to do that. If someone does, and they can kind of message it in the right way, then I think the player that he was in 22 and even 23, it's a good player. That's a useful, positive player. Like I think people compare him to Dan Uggla unfavorably, but Dan Uggla was like a really good player for like 8 years, right? Like he was a guy who was maybe not properly appreciated for kind of what he did because he had the worst All-Star game in like the history of Major League Baseball, and became a punchline. But if that's who Nolan Gorman is, that's a good player who can help a team win games.
Yeah. I was pulling up Dan Uggla, 10 years in the league. I don't know if he had the actual 10 service times. He was in 10 different years, so may have even gotten his pension. Can't argue with anybody that does that.
And I have it right in front of me. Dan Uggla career B-WAR 18.2. Like it's not an all-star, but that's a 2-win per year player over 10 years. That's pretty good.
Yep. And of course, I guess go ahead, Alan.
Well, you had mentioned it. I just want to make sure that I heard you right in the first of the show. You're more optimistic about a Walker rebound than a Gorman.
I just think in general, maybe not necessarily like in terms of what the immediate rebound looks like. I just think in general, in terms of as players, I would put myself higher on Walker than on Gorman, just because like Walker has the kind of physical gifts that are really hard to ignore, and that really like. This is not a fair comparison, and it gets drawn all the time because they're both young black outfielders from Atlanta. But like if Jordan Walker is Jason Hayward, that's still an incredibly good player for stretches. And maybe that means that he's not Aaron Judge, I just think the floor on Walker is even maybe higher than he's being given credit for.
Do you think when Arenado's traded and Gorman, he reportedly becomes our everyday third baseman, and Walker's your everyday right fielder, is there an element to that? Have you seen enough to where you could see them both take off to be highly productive players, knowing that they're, that how you say it, that an 0 for 4 doesn't get you set down?
Yeah, look, I think too, part of it is going to be some sort of like radical acceptance of the player they are, right? Like Nolan
Sure.
Gorman is gonna be a 30% strikeout guy. He just is. That is the way that he swings the bat. He can't be like a 37% strikeout guy, right? Like that last 7% pretty important. But if he also hits 35 homers, then hey, that's ball. Uh, and at the same time, there needs to be a kind of realistic understanding of like, if Jordan Walker isn't Aaron Judge, that's okay because a lot of guys not Aaron Judge
Yeah.
and are still very, productive, useful, helpful ball players, right? Like a guy again who I've heard a comparison drawn to with Walker is Jermaine Dye. Like if Jordan Walker has Jermaine Dye's career,
Yeah.
you should be ecstatic. That's like an incredibly good ball player for 15 years.
I promise you, I'm not trying to dig up dirt on these next questions, but I want to give you an instance on this. Last year, when we were at the Blogger Day, someone asked a similar question about Walker to Mo, and Mo's body language was very readable about there was definitely a disappointment. I took note of that. I was like, that was kind of a strange way to respond to that, because he's usually very, very guarded about the way that he handles those things. I can't remember. It was a podcast, and it may have been Best Podcast in Baseball with Gould a couple weeks ago, where they had one of the prospect writers on there, and he made a comment that there has been some pushback from Walker to buy into what the Cardinals were selling about his approach. Have you seen that? I put those two together to make me that it kind of raised red flags to me, and I really don't want to see that because I have high hopes of him becoming a really, really productive player. Have you seen any indications or heard any indications of those things?
I have not. That's not to say that they don't exist, but I wouldn't say that I have like some really big red flags about how his buy-in has been in the program or whatever. In fact, like I can say that they took steps, this in 24 that I didn't see them taking in 23 to bring guys in. Like we would see the minor league hitting coaches a week at a time. They would come up. The minor league guys would come up and apprentice underneath Turner for a week at a time, and then Russ Steinhorn would go down and backfill for whatever level needed a hitting coach for the week, right? So we saw like a lot of work in terms of trying to get a cohesive message throughout the system this year, more than we've seen maybe in recent years. And so that to me says that whatever the buy-in may or may not be, like the messaging at least has probably been consistent. And if a player doesn't want to buy in, that's tough. That can be a hard thing to manage, but it's also not like totally unprecedented that young players would be a little bit stubborn about what got them to where they are versus, what gets them to where they're going to go, right? Like that's a pretty common phenomenon.
With that being said, do you think that this plan has been in place longer than has been reported as far as the reset, rebuild, however they want to word it?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we got a pretty good indication of that at the winter meetings because the messaging from Mozeliak then was that he had sat down and had a conversation with Nolan in Colorado when they were in Colorado the last week of the season, and that was sort of where this whole process started with Nolan, right? So at least a week before the end of the season, they knew where all of this was going to go. So yeah, sure, I mean, now granted, they did have their end of season press conference, within 48 hours of the end of the season. So yes, they did, but like for a week before, as they were telling people kind of before, before telling it to us. So I do think they were, would it be great if they called us every time they were going to have these meetings? Yeah, sure. But I do think from a more kind of reasonable understanding, I really have not that much in terms of complaint and kind of the speed with which they rolled it out.
Yeah.
So my personal conspiracy theory, I want you to tell me if it's like completely insane or just slightly insane. Is that Mo saw how things were going and couldn't quite translate that to the DeWitts, and that's why he hired Hein Bloom or made a push to get Hein Bloom in here because they needed that extra outside eyes to convince ownership of what he already knew.
What I
Insane or completely insane?
what I would say is that maybe you have read. Like I don't know that I would trust quite as much of Mo's own description of how excited he was about Heim in the beginning.
Ah, okay.
Right. I think that, the way that conversation, and I say that because the way that conversation was described to us at winter warm up last year was Bill DeWitt saying that, I saw that Heim had gotten fired and I thought that's a great idea. So I called Mo and Mo said, yeah, I was just thinking the same thing. Like, yeah, I bet he was. Right. Like, what's Mo going to say when Bill calls him?
Right.
Hey, do you think this guy who would be a very obvious replacement for you should be brought in as a consultant? He's going to say no. Like, right. Like, what are you going to do? The boss is the boss. So they have done a very good job of putting together a very cohesive and united front, and no one has put, any kind of toe out of line in terms of the backbiting of whatever is going on in the office. So they have however people feel inside the walls of their own homes, they have publicly and as a unit moved through this process as flawlessly as you can to date.
We know that Mo has his own way of speaking, but it feels a little bit like he's loosened. Like Alan said, at Blogger Day last year, he was a little less restrained with the body language. I think the idea that he kind of came out at the end of the year press conference and said, specifically that payroll was going to down in his last year as a Pobo, and who knows, maybe his last year in St. Louis at all. I don't know what his plan is after that. Do you think he will be a little bit more or less restrained than he has been, or is that just maybe Mo getting a little older and a little wiser?
I am very interested to see what that looks like because he did some things even down the stretch and stuff that I don't want to talk about that much, but stuff that like Mo did some stuff even down the stretch last year where I was like, this is a guy who sees the end. Like when we knew that, but like it just to the extent that I was fairly convinced that he would step down at the end of the year, up to the day when we all looked around and went, "Oh, Gersh is not here, and everyone else is." So, but no, I do think that there will be some of that. I'll be very interested to see what that looks like for sure. And part of it too is like, and he said something to the effect, again, at the winter meeting, something to the effect of, well, it's part of my job to be optimistic with you guys too, which like debatable. But kind of cop to like, what do you want me to say? Sometimes I got to shine it up a little bit. Um, I do think there will be maybe some more candid peeks behind kind of what his day to day is, especially if, frankly, like if there are grenades to jump on. I'll be very interested to see if he suddenly becomes the guy who does that.
Do you think that they and obviously he's shifting gears. Will he retire? Will he move to another team? Will he stay in St. Louis? What do you think his future plans are? Has he figured out his future plans?
Yeah, I really don't know. I don't have a great read on it. I would love to know. Like I would be so fascinated by that. It would not surprise me in the slightest. If he stayed for a little bit and maybe focused on some charitable stuff, and worked through a foundation, maybe even through Cardinal Care. Though I doubt that. I can see him kind of branching out on his own, and figuring his own thing out, and then just sort of going from there. Do I think that in 3 or 5 years somebody might come calling for him to be, a wise old hand in a Pobo office and he might go do it? I can see that. I can imagine that, but I don't think immediately. I don't think that John Mozeliak is running somebody else's team in 2025. I think, in 2030, is he Dave Dombrowski? Maybe. I can imagine a scenario where Mercenary Mo goes from job to job every 3 years and just puts the hammer down. After 20 years of doing the same thing every year, I can see where that would maybe be an appealing change.
Or in 5 years just become Bing Divine and come back to the front office again.
Look, I never say never, though that would be, if that were to happen in 5 years, there would have been some sequence of events that led to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Alan, you got anything else for Jeff?
My last, I've kind of alluded to it about having the runway to succeed with Gorman, with Walker, with all those things, that the potential of bringing in one more veteran starter to eat some innings. I noticed that FanDuel had them in 4th place at a plus 900, and Pittsburgh in 5th place at plus 950. Is there any scenario that would blow you away where they contend next year?
I guess not, right? Because I guess the thing that you would say is if they hit on all of the position players or whatever, if they hit on 7 of them, that's probably a really good dynamic offense.
Yeah.
I don't know that that is the most likely outcome, but it could, like, that could happen. That's not, outside the realm of possibility. I would have questions about the pitching, but if you told me that, that you swapped Gibson in there and that, do I guess if that were to happen, my first thought would be, oh, you got from Michael McGreevy what you got from Lance Lynn in 2024, right? If they for Michael McGreevy get 115 innings of 3.5 ERA ball, that'd probably be pretty good because he's going to have been really good and really helped them out a lot. So if that happens, yeah, sure, I can imagine that would occur.
So how do I say this? Do you think this is less of a punt and more of a safety net if they're terrible?
What I would say is, as we sit here today on January 3rd, 350 innings of pitching have walked out the door.
Mm-hmm.
And none of it has come back. They've brought in none. Zero innings. Do I think there are 350 innings in the system that are a little better than the 350 that walked out the door? I could find them, maybe, but it would mean that a whole lot of things went right that are unlikely to all go right at once, right? Like, it is possible that they get back to camp and Zach Thompson has figured it out and is the guy that he has been in 3-inning bursts, some of the chances that he's gotten to start. And it is possible that Gordon Graceffo can be Ryan Helsley or can at least be Andrew Kittredge. And it is possible that Quinn Matthews is Chris Sale. That those things are possible. But boy, would they be a lot of things to all happen at the same time.
Yeah.
All right. Well, before we leave, Jeff, I think I have to ask you one really big question. Derek Gould has best podcast in baseball, and now Katie Woo has Cardinals territory. So when is the Jeff Jones podcast coming?
Would you believe me if I've said, and this is the most ridiculous sentence I can say out loud, I've had meetings about this winter. I promise that is true, and it is a ridiculous thing to say out loud. There will be one coming. There are things in motion.
Well, awesome. Now just add to the group, and now keep crowding us out here. We we can't. We already have trouble competing, and all these big shots come in.
Look,
we got trouble.
My thing is this: I don't need anyone to spend any time listening to it. Just play and put it on mute, and just rack up those views, baby. Just crank the numbers. That's all we're looking for here. We're trying to make the spreadsheet go up.
That's right. Always looking for the spreadsheet to go up. All right. Well, Jeff, when do you head down to Jupiter?
I believe I leave on the 8th and arrive on the 9th. 8 hours to Atlanta, 8 hours from Atlanta.
All right. Well, may you have a good trip. May you have a less than chaotic weekend with the weather that's coming through. And as always, we appreciate you joining us.
Anytime, guys. Happy to do it.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate it.
Yep. See you guys.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll be back at you early next week. Supposed to have Brendan Schaefer, who can't do regular scheduling because it's Brendan and he's always got to cause me trouble. But looking forward to talking to him. But until then, until next time, for Alan and for Jeff, I'm Daniel. Good night.
Good night.
The swing and a long fly ball to left by Ozzie.
He wouldn't, would he? He did. Woo!